Cabinet Committee B last met on the 22nd of October. The date for the next meeting has not yet been finalised, but is likely to be in the next few weeks. Cabinet Committee B covers social policy and public services, including education, children's social inclusion, the Irish language, arts and culture, and continued improvements and reform of public services. In addition to meetings of full Cabinet and Cabinet committees, I often meet ministers on a bilateral basis to focus on particular issues. In this regard, I meet regularly with Ministers Doherty and Donoghue to discuss issues relating to social policy and public services. Over the recent period, Government has introduced various reforms through Cabinet Committee B, which seek to improve the lives and standard of living of those most in need are often marginalised by our society. These include the Affordable Childcare Scheme, which is a major priority for this year, the publication of the LGBTI National Youth Strategy, and the Action Plan for Online Safety. Also ratification of the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disability, and further gender equality actions have been driven through this Cabinet Subcommittee.
Howlin.
Taoiseach, this Cabinet Subcommittee is responsible for the arts and culture, I understand. There is, I think most people would now acknowledge, a crisis in this sector, both in terms of wages and working conditions for people across the nation working in the arts. There's also real concern about how our National Theatre is operating. Last week, Taoiseach, as you well know, over 300 actors, directors, designers, agents and playwrights have taken a public stand to express real and built-up concern and dissatisfaction at how the National Theatre is being run. Also this week, we've seen the reality of life for artists in Ireland, how poorly they're paid, many below the minimum wage is revealed in the review of pay and conditions published by the Theatre Forum. The Minister for the Arts has urged dialogue in relation to the Abbey dispute, but this is an issue that concerns our National Theatre, a unique international institution which we're all proud of. It appears to have nothing to say on the commemorations that we're now facing into this year, the century of the First Dáil and the War of Independence. So can I ask you, have these matters been discussed by this Cabinet Subcommittee? Have you a view in relation to these matters? And have you a specific policy directive that the committee has made in relation to the future of the National Theatre and also the sustainability of working in the arts in Ireland?
McDonald.
Thank you, Count Corlin. I think those points are well made by Deputy Howlin. Indeed, the scale or lack of in-house production by the National Theatre, I think, is a cause for concern for all of us. So I look forward to your responses on those questions, Taoiseach. We're approaching the 4th anniversary of the marriage equality referendum, and the decision taken by the people to extend marriage rights to same-sex couples was momentous and defining. That same fundamental right is still not enjoyed by the LGBTQI community in the North, but that's not what I want to raise with you today, Taoiseach. The referendum recognised not only the rights of same-sex couples, but also the rights of their children. And yet government has been found wanting in the delivery of rights for these families. LGBT Ireland is holding an event outside Leinster House here today to highlight the government delay in progressing long-awaited legislative protections for the families they represent. The Children and Families Relationship Act 2015 put in place the legal framework to provide for and protect diverse families and parental rights, and yet parts 2 and 3 of the Act have yet to be commenced. In 2017, the Minister for Health, Simon Harris, issued a statement committing to commence parts 2 and 3 of the Act by the end of the year. But here we are now in 2019 with no revised date for when these legal provisions relating to donor-assisted human reproduction and other important matters will be delivered. The general scheme of the Assisted Human Reproductive Bill 2017 is currently with the Health Committee, so it will be some time before that legislation is introduced. Technical amendments also need to be made to Part 9 of the Children and Family Relationships Act to provide for the registration and re-registration of the birth of a donor-conceived child. I want to thank the Minister for Social Protection for agreeing to introduce these amendments through a standalone bill to speed up this process, and Sinn Féin will support that legislation's speedy passage through the Dáil. The continued Ceann Comhairle legal uncertainty for LGBT parents and their children is wrong, and the buck stops with you, Taoiseach, as head of government. So can I ask what action is being taken to ensure that all outstanding legal protections are delivered for same-sex couples and for their children?
Deputy Boyd Barrett.
Just briefly, although I made the main points on it with the Arts Minister this morning, just to say it to the Taoiseach as well, that I really think we obviously need to urge the Abbey to engage with the signatories, and it's quite a polarised, complicated debate, but all the different stakeholders need to get together and sort these issues out. But at the back of it all, Taoiseach, and this is where the government comes in, at the back of it all across the theatre and arts sector and the film sector, which I've been talking about repeatedly for the last year, there is absolutely no job security, there's no income security, there's no rights, there's no entitlement, there's no jobs. There's just total precarity. And that's at the back of it all. And the government need to address that. In Germany, if you work in the arts, you're effectively a public servant. You're on public servant conditions. Whereas here in Ireland, the land of saints and scholars, we treat artists with contempt. That's the problem, and the Taoiseach needs to address it. But I just want to ask, has your Social Policy and Public Sector Reform Committee addressed the fact that there is another industrial action about to happen with very serious consequences with the National Ambulance Service on the 22nd of January, which is a very serious matter, and it resolves around trade union recognition? Where the HSE is refusing to engage with the NASRA branch of the PNA and is refusing to recognise their right to represent ambulance workers. And as a consequence of that, there is going to be a national ambulance strike on January the 22nd. Now, you've talked a lot about urging negotiation in terms of the nurses' dispute. Can I strongly urge you, Minister, to get onto the HSE and tell them that workers have the right to choose their own trade union and that they should engage urgently with the PNA and NASRA to avert a national ambulance strike on the 22nd of January.
Martin, you want to make a brief contribution?
So thank you indeed, Ceann Comhairle. I would agree with Deputy Howlin, Deputy Boyd Barrett, and I raised this yesterday in terms of the Abbey, our national theatre. And I've made this point before, that there's been a drift. The initiative of Creative Ireland, in my view, had more about political patronage than a genuine substantive investment in the arts. And there was a strong tradition developed over the years of the Arts Council and independent bodies free from political partisanship or influence that would decide arts policy. And I think that needs to be restored. And I think the Abbey, there needs to be a clear policy, national policy direction in terms of what we want from the Abbey and the contribution that we wanted to contribute to the development of theatre and the arts in general. Secondly, you mentioned, Taoiseach, there online abuse. I was at the BT Young Scientists and Technology exhibition last week, and I pay tribute to BT as a private company who sponsor and who've grown that competition significantly over the last 2 decades nearly now. The number of projects from young people about the impact of technology, games like Fortnite and so on, and they're interested in the impact on children's minds, development, concentration, study, the juxtaposition between reading, what's the impact and so on like that. And that contrasts with a gap, if you like, or a reluctance from state agencies to do likewise. Now, the SRI this morning published, I think there was an interesting publication in terms of the impact of mobile phones on young children below 12 years of age. And I think it is time for detailed assessment of these issues. That can be good, of course, and there's lots of positives emerging from technology. But likewise, you mentioned online abuse. There are many, many challenges as well that have emerged from it, which I don't think the state, because the state has a certain deference maybe to the digital companies and their impact and their influence, and there's almost a tiptoeing around the very significant issues that need to be addressed here. And finally, in terms of this Cabinet Committee, you might reaffirm the Government's commitment when we discussed this during the budget negotiations, in terms of the 100 additional therapists to reduce significantly the waiting times and waiting lists for children for speech and language, occupational therapy, psychology and physiotherapy.
Taoiseach, you have about 5 minutes now to respond, if you would, please.
Thanks. Thank you very much. I think first in relation to the arts, the House will be aware that the government and I personally have gave a commitment that we would double our spending on arts and culture over a 7-year period. That's roughly equates to an increase of 10 or 10.5% every year, and we exceeded that in the budget for 2019. There'll be a 12% increase in funding for arts, culture and heritage. That's a combination, of course, of current and capital. And that's invested in lots of different ways, in the National Cultural Institutions, in the Arts Council, through the Film Board, which is now Screen Ireland, also Creative Ireland, and various other different mechanisms, that the Heritage Council, for example. Part of the programme and part of Project Ireland 2040 provides for a new National Theatre to be built, the Abbey Theatre to be demolished. They've already acquired some of the buildings around it. Will allow it to be demolished and rebuilt into a new state-of-the-art National Theatre, which I hope we'll be extremely proud of. People, I'm sure, have been to the National Gallery since the renovation there, and it really looks fabulous. Looks as a national cultural institution should, and I'd certainly like to see those Abbey plans advanced very soon, so that we can have a new National Theatre. I do, of course, acknowledge that a theatre is worth nothing without the artists and the actors who perform in it. And I'm sure that the board, and I'm confident that the board of the Abbey Theatre, the opportunity to meet with the chairman of the board not too long ago, and I'm confident that the board of the theatre will want to respond to the concerns of the artistic community. There are differing views, as Deputy Boyd Barrett acknowledged, but I am confident that the board will want to respond to those concerns, and I expect that they will do so. I don't believe it's the role of the government to interfere in the programme of individual theatres, and I don't think anybody in the House would want us to do that, but I think it's appropriate that, that the board should engage with the concerns. In terms of the incomes of artists and people involved in creative industries, I suppose it is like many businesses or industries or many forms of self-employment or many professions. Some people do very well and do very well financially. Others are not so successful and don't do so well financially. But we have done two things to help. The first is we've amended the Social Welfare Code, did this about 2 years ago, to allow people who are part-time artists who are not making an adequate income or earning sufficient revenues from their art to qualify for job seekers, to qualify for social protection without the requirements that they be full-time looking for employment. And I'm not sure how many people have actually availed of that, but that is there as an option and helps to set a minimum floor of income for those artists. We've also changed the Competition Act as well to allow for freelance artists to engage in collective bargaining under certain circumstances in a way that we don't allow the vast majority of self-employed people or professionals to do. In relation to Dr. McDonald's question on health legislation, it is always the case that government departments and the Office of the Parliamentary Council and government in general has to prioritise legislation in the same way as the Oireachtas and the Seanad has to do so. It's not possible to do all legislation at the same time, either in government or in the Oireachtas, which of course government doesn't control. So the priority for the last 6 months of last year was the abortion legislation, and that was done. And I know the House and the public wanted us to prioritise that. Also, there's the HSE governance legislation to re-establish the HSE board, and that is going through the Houses at the moment. The priority for Q1 and Q2 of 2019 is health legislation related to Brexit, and people understand why that has to be prioritised. Brexit could happen, indeed is scheduled to happen at the end of Q1. So that legislation has to be prioritised, as does the legislation to establish the cervical check tribunal. So they're the health legislative priorities for the first half of this year. However, work will continue on the Assisted Human Reproduction Bill, and I'd anticipate that that will be published sometime this year and hopefully enacted. It is a very complicated piece of legislation. I remember reading all about it when I was in the Department of Health, and it's going to require a lot of debate and some difficult decisions to be made, because this area at the moment, the whole area of assisted human reproduction in Ireland is not illegal, but it's also not legislated for. And there are lots of questions that will require decisions by us as to what is going to be legal and what isn't, including what forms of surrogacy, including whether we'll continue to allow the practice of anonymous donation of sperms and eggs, which I can understand why people would want that to continue. But if you're pursuing a child-centred policy where children have the right to know who their parents are, and that speaks to our history at the moment, perhaps that's something we shouldn't allow. So there's a lot of very difficult judgment calls and decisions to be made, and that will be teased out, I imagine, by some very reflective sessions by the Health Committee.
Question 5, I'm sorry.